Good evening, everyone. I'm going to try that again, right? Good evening, everyone. Thank you. My name is Musa Mushabela. I am the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Cape Town. And I'd like to greet all of you present here. A number of colleagues are here. A number of students are here. A number of visitors are here, guests. A number of other people who are current and former members of this university, a number of people online, I believe, as well. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this inaugural lecture tonight, this evening. It's an absolute pleasure for us to be welcoming you to this evening's inaugural lecture by Professor Adam Mendelsohn, who will be introduced shortly. I'd like to also extend a special welcome to Professor David Bilges from the University of Johannesburg. We are very pleased that you've been able to join us, Prof. Your presence this evening makes the event even more special. Your work and leadership in law and human rights have truly meaningfully contributed to the public discourse in South Africa and beyond. And we are grateful that you have agreed to honor us with your presence. I think I should also just add that, for us at UCT, it also highlights the importance of partnerships between our institutions. We endeavor to ensure that we work collectively across the sector to continue to uplift this country and the continent with the work that we do in education, higher education, and research. Let me also take a moment to warmly welcome the family of Professor Mendelsohn. Are you here? Excellent. So I want to welcome the parents, Richard and Odette. I want to welcome the wife, Andrea, the kids who are present, Sam and Emma. Apparently you guys got banned not to come here. I'm not sure how you managed that. There's also brothers who are here as well as sister-in-law. So welcome to all of you. Let's give them a warm round of applause. Let me just say that inaugural lectures are important to us in the life of the university. They mark an important milestone in the career of an academic when they reach a stage where their contribution, their scholarly contribution to research, to teaching, and to society and public life reflects a level of contribution that we as a university appreciates from the perspective of critical thought and also intellectual exchange. When they reach that point in the form of a personal milestone, but also a collective occasion for us as a university and the attained professorship, we mark that moment with an inaugural lecture. So it's an important stage, both for Professor Mendelsohn, but also for us as the University of Cape Town. So I hope that this evening will also take you on a journey that will assist you to understand how Professor Mendelsohn has reached this point. Before we get there, let me introduce the rest of the platform party in front of you. Closest to me, we've got our Deputy Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, Professor Brandon Collier-Reid. We also have next to him our Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Shose Kesi, who will do the formal introduction of our inaugural lecturer, Professor Mendelsohn. And we then also, as I indicated, have Emeritus Professor David Bilges, who will offer a vote of thanks. So the title today, this evening, is Where to for the Jews. And this topic that will be delivered by Professor Mendelsohn invites us to reflect on questions that are both historically grounded and also forward-looking. It asks us to consider how communities understand their place in a changing world and how the past informs the choices and possibilities of the present and the future. Now, we know that historians are often cautious about predicting the future, but also at moments of uncertainty and transition, they are able to offer careful reflection informed by evidence and historical insight. And I'm sure tonight will not be any different. At UCT, we truly value scholarship, particularly the kind of scholarship that reflects rigorous analysis, that has broader societal questions, and begins to inform our decisions going forward with those outputs, the evidence that is produced. We support research that deepens our understanding, and we encourage dialogue, particularly dialogue across differences. The work we recognize this evening speaks directly to these values, and it will highlight the importance of examining themes such as migration, identity, and belonging. And it shows how historical inquiry can inform how communities navigate complexity and change. So in this regard, universities play a vital role in holding space for these conversations. They bring together diverse perspectives, encourage debate, and support inquiry that crosses disciplines and borders. In doing so, they contribute to a more informed and reflective society. This role is particularly important in a context such as ours, where questions of identity, questions of history, and questions of social cohesion remain central to public life. An inaugural lecture is also a moment to acknowledge the role of teaching, supervision of students, and mentorship in general. The influence of an academic tends to extend beyond just research. It is reflected in the students that they guide, and some of them, students that have been supervised by Professor Mendelsohn, will be present here, and also reflected in the colleagues and the collaborations that Professor Mendelsohn would have formed over the years. There is a whole intellectual community that helped build the body of knowledge and evidence that Professor Mendelsohn is a part of. Many of them will be here and others will be connecting virtually. So I'd like to take this moment to congratulate all of you for the contributions that you have made that shape the work that we are hearing tonight, that shape the discipline, that shape the institution. Professor Mendelsohn, thank you for your contribution to the academic life of UCT, to the broader field of historical scholarship. Thank you for your work and the way that it reflects sustained commitment to understanding how societies evolve, how history shapes identity, belonging, and public life. I now invite Professor Kesi, who will formally introduce Professor Mendelsohn. Thank you very much.
Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mosa Moshabela, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Brandon Collier-Reid, Professor David Bilchitz from the University of Johannesburg, colleagues, friends, and family of Professor Mendelsohn. It is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Professor Adam Mendelsohn is a scholar of rare intellect. These introductory remarks will seek to cover areas of his scholarship contributions that have earned him this well-deserved full professorship. Professor Mendelsohn made his earliest mark in his MA when he wrote a thesis that won acclaim in comparative studies of rabbinical responses to apartheid in South Africa and segregation in the American South. Out of this came an article that outcompeted senior scholars to win the quadrennial award for the best article to appear in Southern Jewish history. This early stardom was kept shining bright when he did his doctoral studies with one of the most preeminent scholars of American Jewish history, Professor Jonathan Sarna. Professor Mendelsohn's dissertation set the standard for transnational history in English-speaking Jewry in the 19th century. His article, Tongue Ties, the Emergence of the English Language Diaspora in the Mid-19th Century, came out of his dissertation and won him a prize for the best article in American Jewish history. His first monograph, The Rag Race, sealed his position as it became a multi-award book. It is widely recognized as a groundbreaking book on Jewish people's garment making and selling in the middle of the 19th century, making it the most important book on Jewish people and the modern clothing industry. Professor Mendelsohn showed how Jewish immigrants clustered this niche that ensured them high social mobility once writing economic and transnational history. Beyond this, the book also explores the circulation of ideas and communication technologies throughout the English-speaking Jewish diasporic communities, spanning the 5 continents that Professor Mendelsohn's work covers. His second book focuses on Jewish soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army. It is viewed as the most important re-examination of Jewish American history in the Civil War since Bertram Korn's pioneering volume on the subject some 70 years ago. This book is part of a volume where the second book's focus will be on Jewish soldiers in the Confederate Army, and collectively, these will illuminate little-known aspects of Jewish history in the US Civil War. His pioneering study of the Anglophone Jewish diaspora emphasizes comparison and interconnection, and looks to determine what, if anything, is distinctive about the experience and behavior of Jews in particular moments in time. Professor Mendelsohn is widely respected for his transnational approach, which makes his work extremely appealing as he engages with Jewish history outside of the nation-state paradigm. Professor Mendelsohn has edited and co-edited in high-impact publications with a sweeping influence in Jewish studies, making him one of the most impactful scholars in his field across the world. He co-edited The Transnational Traditions, a collection of articles that included his own invaluable study of the Isaacs family on 3 continents, setting the bar once again on transnational and transcontinental history. His distinction came from his editorship of a leading scholarly journal, namely the American Jewish History Journal. For 5 years as editor, he maintained and improved the standard for the oldest and best established publication in the field, an honor that only distinguished scholars have the privilege to carry out. He has served on the board of directors of the Association of Jewish Studies, for Jewish Studies, the field's main scholarly organization. He also serves on other editorial and advisory boards of numerous other international journals and organizations. I'm not going to list them all. keeping the name of the University of Cape Town in conversation with internationally leading institutions. Finally, I would like to highlight Professor Mendelsohn's administrative leadership. He directs, and I quote, the most important institution for Jewish research within South Africa, as viewed by international Jewish historians. The conferences hosted at the Kaplan Centre at UCT since Professor Mendelsohn's directorship speak to the caliber of scholarship that he is famous for. He has deepened and widened the research of the centre, mentoring a team of capable researchers who continue on his impressive insights into the study of Jewish life historically and in contemporary times in South Africa. As the Cohen Chair in Jewish Civilization and the Director of the Kaplan Centre, Professor Mendelsohn has commissioned new socio-demographic research about the Jewish community and its relationships with South African society, and he writes and speaks widely to non-academic audiences. External observers have written reviews about the centre, acknowledging its critical evolution under Professor Mendelsohn, who enhanced its international profile through joint conferences with leading institutions abroad, international collaborations, new select publications, and using more formats such as joint workshops that ensure that South African-based researchers continue to have international reach and impact. I am sure that its 50th anniversary in about 4 years' time will greatly honor Professor Mendelsohn's contribution to the Centre. For tonight's inaugural lecture, Professor Mendelsohn will be grounded in history as usual, but will also reflect on possible futures for Jewish people with South Africa as his starting point, but surely with transnational perspectives as it has become iconic of his work. I think we can safely say that we all hope for a future that reckons better with the themes of Professor Mendelsohn's lecture tonight, such as migration, discrimination, mobility, and identity. Esteemed audience members, allow me to invite on stage Professor Adam David Mendelsohn.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and likewise for this an audience of family, friends, and others, and it's deeply meaningful to have you here. So I remember the lecture very well. I was a new PhD student in Boston, part of a cohort of junior scholars being inducted into the field of Jewish history. Our speaker was one of the leading international scholars of modern Jewish history. The study of anti-Semitism, we were confidently told, was stale and irrelevant, a backwater to be avoided. After all, contemporary Jew hatred was a marginal phenomenon, the preserve of extremists on the fringes, a vestige of the past. We were instructed to transcend what was known as the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, a focus on discrimination, marginalization, and suffering, and instead write about the synthesis, the creative interplay between Jews and the societies in which they live. The subtext of the lecture was clear. Jews were living in a golden age of acceptance and inclusion, an era unimaginable to those who came before. And anti-Semitism was yesterday's news, fading into insignificance, unworthy of serious scholarly attention. This was the advice of one of the leading scholars of modern Jewish history but 20 years ago. In retrospect, his predictions have the ring of Francis Fukuyama's now much mocked claim in 1992 that we were witnessing the end of history as liberal democracy triumphed. For much like Fukuyama, we were blithely ignoring evidence to the contrary. the notorious World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, which descended into an anti-Semitic hate fest, for example, was explained away as an aberration. No need for alarmism. So too were other squalls that momentarily darkened the skies. We had the wind at our back and basked in our confidence until the climate changed. The historian Simon Sharma has evocatively compared the last 2 years to, in his words, lifting a floor covering to expose what we'd idly imagined to have long gone, the endlessly festering slough of dehumanization. Scholars, myself included, now routinely marvel at the appearance in mainstream public discourse of anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes of a classical variety. The sensation is like that of a paleontologist transported to Jurassic Park, seeing alive in the wild what we assumed only lived on in textbooks. Phenomena which carry unfortunate echoes of the past, widely shared advice not to wear identifiable Jewish symbols when walking in parts of Paris and London, threats and violence against Jewish institutions, ideological purity tests applied only to Jews have become part of the new normal. And today, the study of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is all the rage. New university research centers, new journals, and new academic programs jostle for attention, trying to make sense of what has happened and what it all means. Within the field of modern Jewish history, there is a sense of rupture, that something profoundly changed after October 2023. What is less clear is whether what we are seeing and studying all around us is new or old. We have seen, for example, the unanticipated reappearance of the Jewish question, a subject that agitated many European societies from the 19th century until World War II. Then the public debate about the Jewish question focused on what was to become of the largest non-Christian minority in Europe. The debate became ugly and urgent, including in South Africa in the 1920s and 1930s. Historically, Jews had been marginalized, persecuted, and excluded. In the 19th century, an age of emancipation and new nation states, what was to become of the Jew? Should Jews be integrated as citizens in the countries in which they lived, and if so, under what terms? Or should they be excluded from society? Jews offered a variety of their own answers to the Jewish question. Some sought full inclusion and acculturation. Others embraced new forms of solidarity rooted in socialism or advocated for cultural autonomy. An initially small but growing minority pushed for a homeland of their own. Debate about the Jewish question was seemingly resolved by the Holocaust, which decimated the Jewish population of Europe, rendering the issue of Jewish integration all but moot, and by the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Yet over the last 2 years, the Jewish question has resurfaced in the public realm in a variety of guises, but often asking modern iterations of the older 19th century questions. Are Jews to retain full acceptance and inclusion within the societies in which they live? If so, is their inclusion conditional on accepting or rejecting particular political positions? Can attachment to Israel, in other words, remain central to Jewish identity? And are Jews required to conform to the dictates and expectations of others? Many Jews, too, have been asking modern versions of the older Jewish question. What, they are asking, is happening in societies and institutions where they once felt most at home? Has a golden age of Jewish life ended? And what does the future hold? These questions reveal much about the anxiety and uncertainty felt by many Jews, but also hold up a mirror to the societies in which Jews live and the institutions with which Jews have long been associated. In essence, they are asking themselves the question I will pose this evening. Where to for the Jews? In answering this question, I will do three things. Firstly, I'll explore some of the ideas that have accreted around the Jew over time and offer some brief thoughts on why the Jew as a phantasm exercises such a hold on the popular imagination. Secondly, I will move from the realm of fantasy and projection to the actual experience of Jews. I will do so by tracing the historical trajectory of Jews in South Africa and by exploring their relationship with UCT. And thirdly, I will examine a handful of contemporary trends that provide hints at what the future may hold for Jews in South African society. I begin with a paradox. The number of Jews in the world today is smaller than the total population of Gauteng, still well short of the historical peak of 16.6 million Jews in 1939, before the Holocaust. Today, Jews make up 0.2% of the world's population, and an even smaller share, 0.08% of South Africa's. The entire South African Jewish population would not even fill Cape Town Stadium. And yet in South Africa and globally, the Jew occupies a prominence in the public and popular imagination that belies their numerical inconsequence. So why is the idea of the Jew so potent? And why do so many societies have Jews on the mind? Some of the reasons are of recent origin, others of much longer duration. And I'll run through some of these very quickly. The first, unfortunately, relates not to living Jews, but to dead ones. The Holocaust occupies a prominent position in public consciousness and as a cultural reference point. Research undertaken by the Kaplan Centre has shown that on social media in South Africa, South Africans resort as readily to Holocaust and Nazi analogies as to motifs drawn from the apartheid era. The hold that the Holocaust has on the popular imagination here and abroad was not inevitable. Scholars who write about the penetration of the Holocaust into mass culture typically trace this to the 1980s and 1990s. In other words, this is a recent phenomenon, and its durability is uncertain. But whether durable or not, it has meant that many are at least superficially familiar with an event inextricably connected with Jews, even only with dead ones. Secondly, the prominence of Jews in America, and particularly in American cultural life, has provided an outsized visibility to Jews and Judaism worldwide. As American cultural influence and soft power has expanded, so too has the figure of the Jew been carried abroad. Again, this is of recent historical origin. Scholars trace the emergence of the concept of Judeo-Christian civilization, which offered a degree of inclusion to Jews in American civic life, to the post-war period. This was cemented by the rise of multiculturalism as a concept and ideal in the 1960s and 1970s. These concepts offered new opportunity for Jews to openly embrace a public identity as Jews. For example, though Jews have long been associated with the entertainment industry, the dominant pattern was for Jews to downplay their particularity. It is no accident that the very Jewish Irving Berlin is known for composing the iconic song White Christmas, the best-selling single of all time, and not for Hanukkah songs. This was not a decision about marketability, but also about the risks of publicly inhabiting an ethnic identity outside the mainstream. Only over the last few decades have we seen an increasing confidence of Jewish artists, authors, comedians, and filmmakers to put overtly Jewish themes and characters on the page and screen. This has made the Jew a visible figure in public life to a degree unimaginable even in the 1960s and 1970s. And thirdly, Israel is unfortunately much in the news. Close to half of the world's Jews now live in Israel. Whatever their own political views and allegiances, and even if they reject Israel, Jews in the diaspora are bound up with Israel. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman recognized this intertwining of fates. Whether praised or censured, revered or berated, the state of Israel and all its works provide the reference point for present-day Jewish identity. Indeed, over the last 2 years, Jewish institutions in the diaspora have been attacked, often rhetorically, sometimes physically, because Jews are associated in the public mind with Israel. The ugly spat between Rodin and King David's High School in Johannesburg was a local example. And intellectuals and public figures have demanded that Jews, as a collective and as individuals, take a public position on Israel, lest they be classed as bad Jews or even worse, as Zionists. Such demands are not made of other individuals or groups. The insistence is that Jews, the Jew, publicly take sides. This is coerced speech. Again, this has ensured that the Jew occupies an unusual degree of prominence in public life. But the idea of the Jew also carries much older cultural baggage. As the parent religion of Christianity, Judaism was cursed by history to be the foil for its progeny. In Christian thought, the Jew became the obverse of the Christian and was invested with symbolic and sometimes diabolical power. In Europe, the Jew had the misfortune to be the largest and most conspicuous non-Christian minority. As David Nuremberg has demonstrated, ideas about the Jew were endlessly mutable, reimagined and repurposed in every age to meet contemporary needs. The Jew was a screen on which to project social anxieties and fantasies that revealed much more about the projector than about actual Jews. In the medieval period, some of the most pernicious persecution of Jews was abetted by converts from Judaism to Christianity, whose voices were amplified by the church. These converts were presented as witnesses to Judaism's immorality and perversion, truth tellers who had seen the light, able to speak with authority about all that was wrong with Jews. The torturous millennial-long relationship between Christianity and Judaism has many legacies. There are certainly echoes in the present of a past eagerness to pronounce authoritatively on what Jews ought to think and believe, how to understand and define prejudice against them, and who amongst them is good and bad. Islam has its own complicated relationship with Judaism, far less rosy than imagined by those who idealize the treatment of religious minorities in pre-modern Islamic societies. Here, too, the Jew has been invested with outsized meaning and significance. Beyond the religious realm, the idea of the Jew was reimagined in the 19th century as the midwife of modernity. In much of medieval Christian society, the Jew had been a marginal figure, expelled from England, France, and Spain, and elsewhere obliged to cling to scorned occupations like peddling, pawnbroking, and trading in second-hand goods. With the exception of a small elite, the dominant Jewish experience in much of Europe was of poverty and marginalization. The coming of industrialization and urbanization, alongside the immense impact of the emancipation of Jews in the 19th century, propelled Jews from marginal occupations and marginal status to the center of the new economic and social systems brought by modernity. In general, Jews entered industries related to their original trades: tailors into textiles, hardware dealers into metal manufacturers, peddlers into storekeepers. Later in the 19th century, they joined the free liberal professions en masse, becoming doctors, lawyers, and journalists. Within 2 generations in Central and Western Europe, families that experienced grinding poverty saw their fortunes transformed. And in the United States, Jews became the single most economically successful immigrant group in American history. This pattern of dramatic social and economic mobility among Jews was at odds with the experience of many others in these societies whose economic and social status was disrupted by industrialization and urbanization. The conspicuous success of Jews, much remarked on and puzzled over, at the time bred resentment. and it made the Jew a symbolic embodiment of modernity for those who disapproved of the profound social changes wrought by industrialization and urbanization. For those disgruntled with social and economic change, the Jew was easily imagined as the unjust and mysterious beneficiary of processes that had wrought massive dislocation and disruption to the wider society. As Shulamit Volkov has described, the Jew came to stand for modernity, for success under its auspices, for the manipulation of its advantages, and the destruction of all remnants of the old world. For those on the political left, the Jew was easily imagined as the arch-capitalist exploiter. For those on the right, the Jew was easily imagined as the socialist revolutionary, undermining the foundations of society. This line of thinking about Jews from left and right now associated Jews with money and power, and gave birth to a potent set of fantasies about how Jews use money and power to subvert, control, and manipulate. Paradoxically, such fantasies allow for an obsession with Jews despite and because their numbers are so small. These fantasies assume Jewish conspiracy, that they are working together for a malign purpose. When enmeshed with racial thought in the 19th century, these ideas position Jews as perpetual and unassimilable outsiders and as an active danger to the nation. In South Africa, we are schooled to think of race in terms of black and white. In Europe and elsewhere, anti-Semites fixated on the Jew as the racial outsider. We still see echoes of these ideas today in the trope of the Jew as manipulator of financial markets, of the Jew as power-hungry and self-interested, of the Jew as social upstart and as perverter of social morals, and in the idea of Jewish conspiracy. Paradoxically, this is fed by the outsized prominence of the Jew in the public imagination for all the reasons that I've described. It's a perpetual motion machine for prejudice. But it is also fed by the conspicuous success of Jews today. Jews delight in the success of other Jews, basking, for example, in the reflected glory of their Nobel Prize winners, and eagerly boasting that 22% of all Nobel Prize winners have been Jews. But so do those who despise them. They also delight in enumerating Jewish success, albeit assuming that the success is unjustly gained and sinister in purpose, a cancer on the body politic, rather than as a positive contributor to the collective good. Similarly, older medieval tropes about Jews have been endlessly adapted to fit modern circumstances. For all these reasons and others, some dating back millennia, some of more recent origin, the idea of the Jew carries cultural baggage that far outweighs their small numbers. But the carapace built up around the Jew tells us very little about the actual experience of Jews. These are not just the put upon and passive objects of history. For as much as it is important to understand perceptions of Jews, we also need to understand their agency, what they want, what they think, and what they have done despite and because of how they have been imagined. So now from the global to the local. What has any of this to do with the experience of Jews in South Africa? And why is this relevant to the present and future? In the long durée of Jewish history, the Jewish community of South Africa is of recent origin. Jews were legally barred from settling at the Cape until 1803, and their numbers remained small for the next 50 years. This pattern was similar elsewhere in the English-speaking world. There were scarcely 15,000 Jews living in the United States in 1840, fewer than 500 in British Canada, and 60 lonely pioneers in hardscrabble New Zealand. At the time, and indeed for the whole of the 19th century, by far the largest share of Jews worldwide lived in the borderlands of the Russian Empire, in the Pale settlement that today stretches from Latvia and Lithuania on the Baltic, across Poland, Belarus, Ukraine on the Black Sea. For the most part, Jews in Russia were restricted to living within the Pale settlement and were unable to legally move elsewhere within the Russian Empire. Significant numbers of Jews also lived in North Africa and urban centers of the Ottoman Empire, including Baghdad, Cairo, and Jerusalem. This pattern began to shift dramatically in the last quarter of the 19th century because of an exodus of Jews from the Russian Empire. This exodus was initiated by young people leaving the poorest regions within the Pale settlement, where population growth and economic stagnation had produced dire poverty and downward economic mobility. The Jewish population in the Pale settlement increased fivefold between 1800 and 1900 at the same moment that their traditional occupations were undercut. By the last quarter of the century, many Jews saw little future for themselves in the Russian Empire, a sentiment reinforced by the outbreaks of acute violence, pogroms against Jews, and a government that was often antagonistic towards Jews and other religious minorities. The vast majority of Jewish immigrants, 1.5 million, moved westwards into Central and Western Europe and then on to the Americas, with offshoots to Ottoman Palestine, South Africa, and Australia. This was an age of mass migration. At the same moment that Jews were leaving en masse, and for some of the same reasons, more than 1 million Muslims were escaping the Russian Caucasus for the Ottoman Empire, settling in large numbers in the Levant. As Vladimir Troyansky, the historian of this migration, has argued, there's much overlap in the specific direction and religious mandate of Jewish and Muslim immigration from the Russian Empire into the Levant, as well as in their origins in persecution and mass flight. The number of Jews who made their way to South Africa was much smaller than those who went to the United States, but South Africa became a compelling destination following the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886. The Jewish population grew almost tenfold, from 4,000 in 1880 to more than 38,000 in 1906. A few arrived with means, including the Beit brothers, who came from Hamburg and were later to gift £500,000 that kick-started the building of UCT. But the vast majority came from what today is Lithuania and Latvia, a region whose economic prospects were particularly poor. Chain migration gave the Jewish community some of its enduring features, including an intense Zionism carried by the immigrants to these shores. These newcomers settled in small towns across South Africa, in many ways recreating the economic roles that they had played in Eastern Europe as intermediaries between farmers and larger markets. They became peddlers, smosa, storekeepers, hoteliers, and traders. A yearbook published in 1929, which you can see excerpted behind you, gives us a window into their dispersion across rural South Africa and the world they created for themselves. Note the proliferation of Zionist societies in the towns and villages where they settled. This, alongside religion, became the organizing principle of Jewish life. There were already over 60 of these Zionist societies in South Africa by 1905, and many more by 1929. Although they were always dissenters, particularly those drawn to radical left-wing politics, in South Africa their numbers were small. Coming from the Russian Empire, where Jews were experiencing an acute crisis and where Jews were subjects rather than agents of history, Zionism held revolutionary appeal. It promised Jews the opportunity to determine their own fate. The Zionism that immigrants carried with them to South Africa was driven by an urgent contemporary imperative to provide haven to Jews in a homeland of their own, but also drew upon deep cultural and religious roots. Anyone with even passing acquaintance with Jewish liturgy is familiar with daily invocations of Jerusalem and Zion, and with the intonation of next year in Jerusalem. Jews in the diaspora had traveled to and settled in what they regarded as the Holy Land ever since the formation of the Jewish diaspora in the 8th century BCE, and had an unbroken, continuous presence there since antiquity. In the second half of the 19th century, these older religious and cultural traditions, practices, and aspirations fused with the search for safety and for self-determination to create modern Zionism. This was a moment when many other ethnic and national groups were similarly engaged in national projects. As with these other movements, Zionism was broad, diverse, and internally fractious. From the start, Zionism has meant different things to different people. There are left-wing versions and right-wing, religious and secular, cultural and fiercely practical, capitalist, socialist and Marxist, bi-nationalists and exclusivists. This variety and dynamism is erased in present-day discourse. Instead, the term Zionism is much misunderstood and is the subject of endless projection. These projections typically tell us more about the agenda, motives, and biases of those who seek to describe and define Zionism than about Zionism itself. Sound familiar? But at its core, Zionism is a simple idea. Jews are a people and deserve self-determination, as do other peoples. If we believe in the right of people to form nations, then this is an unremarkable idea. Despite moving to South Africa and not Ottoman Palestine, Zionism gave Jewish immigrants to South Africa a sense of common purpose, pride, and solidarity. Despite moving far from the centers of Jewish life, through Zionism, Jews in South Africa could still participate in a grand collective project of helping to build a state where Jews could determine their own fate. Even as they and their children acculturated into South African society, most honored strict religious observance in the breach, Zionism provided an alternative civil religion to many Jews. These immigrants typically sent their children to public schools so that the second generation was thoroughly South Africanized. For Jewish immigrants and their children, public school and then university education promised a degree of social and economic mobility unimaginable in the Russian Empire. In the Russian Empire, Jews encountered severe restrictions that limited their ability to move out of the Russian borderlands and into more prosperous cities like St. Petersburg, as well as limits on access to universities. The first state-mandated quota, the numerous clauses, was introduced by the Russian state in 1887 and set limits on the admission of Jewish students to 10% in the Pale Settlement, 5% outside the Pale Settlement, and 3% in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Here the story intersects with that of the University of Cape Town. There were no such limits at the South African College, the forerunner of UCT. As Howard Phillips has described, the college, then in central Cape Town and what is now the Hidden Campus, took its cue from Scotland. In addition to being staffed by Scottish professors, in 1900, over 40% of its academic staff were graduates of Scotland's 4 universities. It adopted the openness to Jews and other religious dissenters typical of Scottish universities. As a result, the South African College and then UCT became a magnet for Jewish immigrants and their children. Because of this phenomenon, Scottish professors teaching Jewish immigrants, the college and then UCT were jokingly referred to as the Scottish mission to the Jews. If you'll indulge some personal history, my own family reflects the transformative encounter between immigrants and the University of Cape Town. All 4 of my grandparents were children of immigrants. My maternal grandfather, Louis Resnick, was one of 6 siblings, grew up in Salt River with a cow in the backyard. His parents came from Lithuania, his father working at a meat wholesaler. His older brothers did not go to university. One ran a small clothing store, another sold wholesale textiles, another worked for Fashini's. But he and his younger brother both went to UCT Medical School. After specializing as an OBGYN in Manchester, he returned to practice in Cape Town and to train UCT medical students at Somerset Hospital. Here was the transformative power of the university. Within a single generation, the children of immigrants achieved prosperity and status unimaginable to their immigrant parents and entirely inaccessible in the Pale Settlement. The same was true for my paternal grandparents. Leonard Mendelsohn was one of 4 children who grew up above the modest family store on Main Road in Wynberg. He went to Wynberg Boys, where he developed a lifelong passion for cricket and rugby, part of the process of acculturation typical of the children of immigrants, and then on scholarship to UCT's medical school in the mid-1930s. There was no money to send his 3 sisters to university, the subject of considerable resentment on their part. At the university, he met Enid Deitch, unusually her well-to-do Lithuanian immigrant father insisted that his daughters receive a university education. Enid wanted to be a nursery school teacher, but her father insisted on medical school. Her sister went to UCT's architectural school and her brother to MIT. Enid was amongst an early cohort of women to graduate from UCT Medical School. A letter of reference describes her as a promising doctor, to quote, notwithstanding her disability, that is, being a woman. As this demonstrates, we should not idealize UCT. At the same time that Jewish students were welcome, the university admitted very few black students. Most black South Africans were denied the transformative upward mobility that university education enabled. Yet even in taking the step of admitting a few black students, UCT was, according to Howard Phillips, far in advance of both prevailing white public opinion and all other white South African residential universities. When it came to admitting Jews, the broader context is also significant. In the 1930s, when my grandparents were students at UCT, Jews had been hounded from universities in Germany, increasingly made unwelcome at universities in many other countries. In Poland, home to more than 3 million Jews, the largest Jewish population in Europe at the time, universities had become sites of conflict as right-wing student groups used violence to intimidate Jewish students and to pressure universities to introduce quotas. Although official restrictions were never formally implemented, some departments restricted the admission of Jews. They were more successful in introducing segregation into the classroom with separate seats for Jewish students. This was officially introduced at Warsaw University, the largest university in Poland, in 1937, but had been imposed earlier by nationalist students who beat those Jews who did not comply and intimidated reluctant professors. And in the United States, home to the largest Jewish community in the world at the time, more than 4 million Jews in the late 1930s, Jews were actively restricted from attending most American universities. Notoriously, Harvard University led the charge in the early 1920s when it very publicly imposed quotas severely limiting the admission of Jews. It did so because of what it openly termed a Jewish problem, that is, too many Jewish students. Many American universities followed suit. Strikingly, UCT did not introduce quotas despite pressure to do so. Vice Chancellor John Carruthers Beatty, Jock Beatty, insisted in 1928 that, in his words, as long as I and others are here, there will be no discrimination against Jews. Such sentiment was not a given at the time. As Milton Shane has written, this was an era where the Jewish question entered South African political life. It was no accident that UCT's nickname, the Ikeys, comes from this same period. It originated in 1919 at the intervarsity rugby match against Stellenbosch University, when students from the latter institution sang songs taunting UCT. One of their grounds for doing so was the large number of Jewish students at the University of Cape Town. At the time, the registrar estimated that nearly a quarter of all students at UCT were Jewish. Ike was a shortening of the name Isaac and was used as a slur to refer to Jews. It's not unrelated to the word kike. The UCT SRC formally complained to Stellenbosch about the lyrics of the song with no effect. Stellenbosch's students knew they had struck a chord and the name stuck in the 1920s and 1930s precisely because it carried a sting. Today, it is shorn of its original meaning and now worn as a badge of pride, but is a vestige of this era when it meant something, that UCT attracted and accepted Jewish students. This original meaning of Ike as an ethnic slur has all but been forgotten. This forgetting is itself telling, reflecting the public forgetting that Jews as a minority were discriminated against, as well as the erasure of Jewish history from public narratives in South Africa. From my description of my grandparents' experience and of the contrast that it formed with the world at the time, you can begin to understand the deep sense of attachment and loyalty felt by many Jews towards UCT, as well as the particular role of the university as a social and economic escalator. Thanks to this history, Jews have long felt entirely at home at UCT. This was a place that transformed their families' trajectories. This was a place where the application of liberal values, as exemplified by the broad-minded John Carruthers Beatty, offered inclusion and acceptance when this was not a given. Hence the Jewish faith in liberalism as a protector of minority rights. This was a place where ability and talent counted more than social origins. This was a place where an anti-Semitic slur, Ike, was ultimately transvalued into a badge of pride. Given the sense of attachment, Jews constituted a significant minority among students for more than a century, and particularly so in the medical faculty. Between 1922 and 1929, for example, 29% of all medical graduates at UCT were Jewish. In 1939, when my grandparents were at medical school, a little under a third were Jewish. A final example of what Howard Phillips describes as a congenial environment for Jews is telling. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, UCT gave a leave of absence to 77 Jewish students who wished to volunteer in Israel. One member of the University Senate thought this infringed on South Africa's declared policy of neutrality in Arab-Israeli matters, but refrained from raising this, in his own words, in light of the strong Jewish representation in the Senate. How times have changed. So for the reasons I've described, UCT has a particular and emblematic relationship with Jews. And the same is true for Wits. But for good or ill, the University of Cape Town also tells us a lot about the present of Jews in South Africa. And it may also tell us a lot about their future too. I'll move now to the third and final section of my lecture, turning from the historical to the present day. Over the last 2.5 years, the South African Jewish community has become acutely aware of its vulnerabilities. Crisis can be clarifying, revealing the impact and influence of longer-term processes whose implications have hitherto not been fully understood. For example, though we have long been aware of demographic decline, the broader implications of this were not fully appreciated. The Kaplan Centre has tracked these numbers for more than 4 decades. At its zenith in 1970, the Jewish community in South Africa numbered 118,000. In 2001, we estimate there were at least 69,000 Jews in South Africa. Today, it's closer to 50,000. This is largely the product of immigration. I was reminded of this on a visit last month to Toronto, where I was hosted for supper by friends who had recently left South Africa. Their other guests emigrated as teenagers in the early 1990s. By happenstance, one had been the same year as me at a Jewish primary school in Cape Town. She produced a photograph of our Standard 4 class from 1991. More than half of our 24 classmates no longer live in South Africa. This is confirmed in data collected by the Kaplan Centre. The effects of immigration are now accentuated by aging. The median age of Cape Town's Jewish population is 45, as compared with the national average for the broader South African population of approximately 28. These twin processes of aging and demographic decline are a global phenomenon. Outside of Israel and America, almost everywhere, the Jewish population is shrinking. Despite its own decline, South Africa still has the 11th largest Jewish population in the world, but only because those below it on the list are shrinking too. The latter also reflects a profound process of geographical consolidation over the last century. A once global people has become concentrated in a handful of countries. Some of this is a consequence of the all but disappearance of substantial and ancient Jewish communities in North Africa and the Middle East, largely because these countries expelled their Jewish populations after 1948. In some places, that process began before the creation of the State of Israel. In Iraq, for example, many Jews saw the writing on the wall after the infamous Fahud in Baghdad in June of 1941, 2 days of rioting and murderous violence targeting Jews. 40% of Baghdad's population was Jewish at the beginning of the 20th century. Today, a handful of Jews remain in Iraq. In 1948, there were 65,000 Jews living in Cairo. Today, there is reportedly only one with Jewish parentage and Egyptian citizenship, the last Egyptian Jew in Cairo. It is for this reason, the mass forced exodus of Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, that today more than half of Israel's Jewish population traces its origin to places in the Muslim world where there are barely any Jews left. Outside the Middle East and North Africa, we have seen a hollowing out of Jewish communities in Ethiopia, Yemen, and India. The exodus of Jews from Russia and Ukraine over the last 3 decades has been equally dramatic. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Jews have voted with their feet. In 1970, there were more than 1.8 million Jews in the Soviet Union. Today, there are just over 160,000 in the former Soviet states. Most moved to Israel, followed by the United States. The result is that only 9 countries globally have more than 100,000 Jews, and only 2, Israel and America, have more than 500,000. The distribution of the Jewish world today looks entirely different than it did 100 years ago. Within South Africa, America, Australia, and other countries, we've seen a parallel process of consolidation. Whereas in 1929, as demonstrated in the yearbook that I showed you, Jews lived across South Africa. Today, the population is concentrated in Johannesburg and Cape Town. As a result, fewer South Africans will interact with Jews on the street, in schools, in the workplace, and in social settings, rendering them less visible and less familiar. The result is that most South Africans have never knowingly met a Jew, and that absence matters. As historian Jessica Roitman has argued, in places where Jews are more visible, people can disapprove of Israel's policies while still knowing Jews as neighbors, colleagues, or friends. In places where Jews are not present, that distinction is much harder to make, and demonization of Israel or anti-Semitic biases face less friction. Although the Jewish community has long been aware of these slow and ongoing demographic processes, which have a very real impact on its ability to fund its own institutions and support an aging population, it took the recent crisis to make it fully aware of the political and psychic implications of its reduced numbers. Unfortunately, this post-October 7th crisis relates to the place that Jews occupy in South African society. Not for decades has the place of Jews in society been so uncertain. Even though they are full citizens and their rights are protected by the Constitution, the figure of the Jew has resurfaced in South African public life. This manifests as crass prejudice, in an obsession with Jews in the media, in a differentiation between good Jews and bad Jews amongst public intellectuals and academics, in the targeting of Jewish-owned businesses and performers for boycotts as if they are an extension of the Israeli state, and in the dismissal of the concerns expressed by Jews. The latter is very telling. All of the frankly ludicrous debate in South Africa about definitions of anti-Semitism, much of it deeply ignorant, conducted in bad faith, and often itself a symptom of prejudice, has distracted from the actual problem of anti-Semitism. This would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. Here at UCT, and in fact in this very building, we have been told that Jews instrumentalize claims of anti-Semitism for malign purposes, a view endorsed by some members of UCT's council. Tell that to the victims of the massacre on Bondi Beach. Can you imagine the same being said for other groups, other forms of prejudice that Black South Africans or Muslims or any other group invent, inflate, and instrumentalize the prejudice against them? Again, this draws upon a long history of assuming that Jews are engaged in conspiracy, that they are acting to advance their own interests at the expense of others. The real problem, however, is not one of definitions, but of hate. Just last month, synagogues, a school, a kosher restaurant, and a Jewish ambulance service were attacked in Detroit, in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Antwerp, and London, respectively. Before coming here Today, the lead story on the BBC was a knife attack on Jews in North London. In the United States, where Jews account for only 2% of the American population, in 2024, 69% of all religiously motivated hate crimes and more than 16% of all reported hate crimes targeted Jews. This was part of a long-established pattern, signs of an unhealthy obsession with the Jew. South Africa has thus far been largely spared the violence we've seen elsewhere. There's no single or simple explanation for this. And some of it, unfortunately, fortunately reflects luck. For example, that a pipe bomb failed to go off outside Jewish communal offices in Cape Town in December 2024. But there's no shortage of anxiety and vigilance. Jewish institutions are heavily guarded, all the more so over the last 2.5 years. Herzliya has had men with shotguns outside since November 2023, when the school was accused by 2 speakers at a large Palestinian solidarity march in Cape Town of, to quote, training murderers. No one challenged them. None of this is normal. Unfortunately, I have heard of plenty of examples from students here at UCT about their own experiences of being excluded and targeted, and of concealing what school they went to, concealing what their religious identity is, concealing clothing and jewelry that could visibly mark them as Jewish. This evidence is anecdotal, and the problem appears to be sporadic rather than endemic, but echoes broader reporting on the experience of Jews in South Africa over the last 2 years. The Kaplan Centre's own systematic research tells a dark story. Since 2021, we have systematically tracked racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism on social media in South Africa. In 2022, we drew cautiously hopeful conclusions relating to online anti-Semitism. The successes of platforms encountering anti-Semitic content relative to xenophobic and racist content seem to offer a glimmer of hope. How wrong we were. Since 2024, we have seen a surge of anti-Semitic content on Facebook, X, and TikTok. These are public posts on public Facebook groups, form part of public discussion on X, and circulate as public short videos on TikTok. Much of this material is crude content of a classical anti-Semitic variety. Nonetheless, it has been normalized. It escapes comment, criticism, and moderation, and too often breaches the barriers between the virtual realm and the real world. Typically, this content takes 3 forms. Firstly, motifs traceable to medieval European anti-Semitism, blood libel accusation that Jews are bloodthirsty or use the blood of Christian and Muslim children for ritualistic purposes, depictions of Jews as satanic or demonic forces, and portrayal of Jews as inherently malevolent beings. Such tropes do not appear as historical references, but as contemporary accusations. A second and more pervasive cluster involves conspiratorial narratives. Here, Jews are depicted as orchestrators of hidden power structures, controlling and manipulating from the shadows. A third category involves what may be termed Zionist substitution rhetoric. Although many posts reference Zionists rather than Jews, contextual analysis reveals that the distinction is largely semantic. The term Zionist frequently functions as a collective proxy, especially when paired with classical conspiratorial tropes or claims of global control. This substitution performs 2 functions. First, it offers rhetorical insulation against accusations of anti-Semitism. Second, it reframes anti-Semitic narratives as ostensibly political critique. However, when collective guilt, biological metaphors, or dehumanizing imagery are indiscriminately attached to Zionists, the boundary between political speech and ethnic demonization collapses. In South Africa, this dynamic is amplified by the moral authority of an anti-colonial vocabulary. When Zionists are framed as demographic infiltrators or colonial occupiers, anti-Semitic narratives fuse with locally resonant grievances concerning land, race, and historical injustice. The effect is dehumanization, casting anyone who can be accused of Zionism as being beyond the pale. In retrospect, what had appeared as positive signs in our research about online hate in 2022 reflected displacement rather than decline. Anti-Semitism in 2022 had merely receded from view. The post-October 7th moment gave new purpose and life to an existing repertoire of hateful ideas and assumptions. This underscores that anti-Semitism in digital or other environments, including universities, cannot be treated merely as content to be banned or removed, but as a resilient, flexible, and adaptive ideology that is organized around a conspiratorial architecture. This elasticity enables anti-Semitism to absorb new grievances, from anti-globalization rhetoric to claims of complicity in genocide, and to remain relevant and resonant over time. To illustrate this, I'll offer an unfortunate local example from a speech given in South Africa in October 2024. To quote, "Every time we protested, the Zionists were too clever. They were arrogant, acting with impunity, putting fear into you. They put fear into corporations, into universities, into communities, into governments, into political parties, into associations. They run the world with fear. They control the world with money. And every time you say something, they terrify you and say it's anti-Semitic. But I've got a message for them. Find a new narrative. This one is dull, boring, and stupid." Here we see the hallmarks of conspiratorial thinking, as well as mechanisms, substitution, euphemism, accusations of collective disloyalty, of a maligned strand of anti-Zionist rhetoric. Telling here is that the speaker chose to use a very particular set of tropes that have a long anti-Semitic history about money, power, subversion, fear-mongering, manipulation, conspiracy. Why draw on these particular tropes? Harsh criticism of Israel, its government, its policies, wartime actions can be framed in many ways. But why imagine Zionists in a way that reflects classical anti-Semitic ideas about Jews, money, power, and conspiracy? Substitute Zionist with Jew in this diatribe, and we have Der Stürmer, the Nazi rag infamous for dehumanizing Jews. Statements of this kind, not the only example from the same speaker, point towards another troubling tendency. Over the last 2.5 years, we've seen an effort to marginalize most Jews by rendering Zionism beyond the pale, transfiguring an unremarkable idea deeply rooted in Jewish historical experience and religion, that Jews should have a homeland of their own, into a Frankenstein's monster that is imbued with all that is evil. A core element of Jewish identity thereby becomes morally suspect, and Zionists are rendered unpeople. These processes are not unlike those from the start of my lecture, when I described how the idea of the Jew became the subject of endless projection, a vessel for projected prejudices. As in times past, some of the flag bearers for these malevolent messages have been Jews. A small minority of Jews have presented themselves as truth tellers, good Jews who are at odds with the morally blind, bad Jewish majority. They have appeared to build an identity around this role, reveling in the attention and validation that they receive publicly for having seen the light. This phenomenon is particularly pronounced in academia, perhaps because it inverts a standard status hierarchy. Suddenly, they transcend their whiteness. They have a rapt audience who celebrate and amplify all they have to say, particularly when it's directed at other Jews or the Jewish community, or about matters about which they have no expertise, like the history and nature of anti-Semitism. Somehow, as Jews, they know the truth. The standards of evidence and analysis that we would otherwise expect and demand in academia evaporate in the face of their truth. And because they are Jews and therefore paraders as preachers of the true gospel, others are able to safely echo their opinions. They provide license and cover to others. Society typically frowns on lecturing religious groups about their beliefs, or generalizing about ethnic groups, or accusing the victims of prejudice of inflating and inventing the prejudice they experience. But this dynamic neatly bypasses that problem. What has troubled many Jews is how these broader dynamics and how such views have been normalized. Anti-Semites rarely view themselves as acting out of hatred. Instead, they believe they are acting for the good of society. But in South Africa, we seem to have become confused when crass prejudice masquerades as principled politics. Too many people nod along, join the bandwagon, or stay silent. As a consequence, many Jews in South Africa feel intensely vulnerable. They are aghast as outsiders attempt to dictate to them what they must think and what is an acceptable component of their identity. A community much reduced in size has seemingly been abandoned by institutions that once stood by principle. Many Jews, in turn, have responded to this betrayal by cutting ties with those same institutions, no matter how long and deep their historical association has been. And unfortunately, UCT has not been immune. To provide but one example, the speaker who I cited earlier, a moment ago, he who inveighed against clever, arrogant Zionists acting with impunity, putting fear into you, putting fear into corporations, into universities, into communities, into governments, into political parties, into associations. He who claimed they run the world with fear, they control the world with money, was awarded an honorary doctorate by UCT last month. Instead of peeling away the carapace of malign ideas that have built up around the Jew, UCT has added a lacquer of respectability to the newest layer of hateful thinking about Jews. The message is that holding and propagating such crude and hateful ideas is no disqualification from earning one of UCT's highest honors. Alarming, too, is UCT's willingness to ignore the entreaties of those who pointed out that doing so was deeply problematic. So too was the gleeful public shaming, the bullying of those who publicly and privately questioned UCT's decision. We see here further an extraordinary illiberalism, intolerance, and ugliness. So much of the bile directed their way has presented them and their concerns as an extension of foreign states, as representatives of Israel, somehow responsible for its actions. All of this for voicing dissent, for exercising the right to disagree. My worry here is not only for UCT, but what this ugly and stupid outpouring says about South African public life. Is there to be no room for disagreement or even expressing a contrary opinion? As I described earlier, the historical relationship between Jews and UCT has long been emblematic of the place of Jews in South African society. This relationship has frayed over the last 2 years. Many Jewish staff despair at the campus climate, the accumulation of slights, insults, and ugliness, the ease at which tropes about Jewish money and power, as well as other stereotypes, have been mouthed by colleagues as well as in council, an administration that's seemingly indifferent, befuddled, incapable of meaningful intervention. And this despair is not limited to staff. Many long loyal alumni have cut all ties. And tellingly, many Jewish students are voting with their feet by preferring Stellenbosch to UCT. What a historical irony. They have understood UCT to be telling them that they do not belong here and that no length of history will protect them at UCT. Unfortunately, the award of an honorary doctorate by UCT to a person who openly and unabashedly traffics in anti-Semitic tropes in the present may also be a sign of the future for Jews in South Africa. This is a future where Jews are marginalized, maligned, and made unwelcome. I hope I am wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mendelsohn. Let me invite David Bridges to come and give a vote of thanks.
the Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Teaching and Learning, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Mendelsohn, Professor Mendelssohn's family, honored guests, and esteemed audience, greetings. I'm deeply honored to have been invited to respond to Professor Adam Mendelsohn's outstanding inaugural lecture. I've long been an admirer of Professor Mendelsohn's deep and meticulous academic work on American Jewish history, including his seminal book, The Rag Race, which won the prestigious National Jewish Book Award in America, and his more recent work on Jews in the American Civil War. I've also admired his decision to return to South Africa after a promising career in the United States to head up the Kaplan Centre for Jewish Studies, the last remaining academic centre in South Africa, which focuses on Jewish studies. In that role, Professor Mendelsohn has assumed a significant intellectual leadership position and become the leading voice in understanding the current demographics and trends in the South African Jewish community. His lecture tonight has woven together a deep understanding of general worldwide Jewish history and demography, together with a firm understanding of the South African community's trajectory. He has masterfully blended together a broader perspective with a focus on the particular history of UCT as well as that of his own family, to provide some insights into the potential trajectory of this increasingly shrinking community in South Africa. In doing so, he follows in the footsteps of two giants of South African Jewish history, his father, Professor Richard Mendelsohn, who was a former head of the history department at this university, together with Professor Milton Shane, the former director of the Kaplan Centre. Their marvelous book on the Jews in South Africa was deeply helpful in preparing this response. As you heard, Professor Mendelsohn's conclusion is rather pessimistic and might lead one to wonder whether the 200-year-old presence of Jews in South Africa will soon come to an end. Whilst I share many of Professor Mendelsohn's concerns and believe he has put a compelling case for his perspective, I think we may cautiously also have some reasons to hope. My comments and response will trace the deep historic sensibility of vulnerability and insecurity amongst Jews, given expression in the aphorism by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov that the whole world is a very narrow bridge. Interestingly, the 1993 Constitution of South Africa described itself as an historic bridge between a past of injustice and a future founded on equality and the recognition of human rights, democracy, and peaceful coexistence. Ultimately, I shall contend that the constitutional era gave expression to a promise that has the potential to provide Jews in South Africa with a deep sense of belonging. The extent to which the ideals contained in our Constitution are honored and concretized not only in law, but in wider societal attitudes and practices will determine the future flourishing of the Jews in this country. So Professor Mendelsohn begins his lecture with a question as to why the Jew is so prominent in public discussions and debates today, given the relative insignificance of the community size worldwide. Professor Mendelsohn has given many compelling explanations for this. I would add perhaps just a small footnote. Jews were a people who for a long period after the loss of their sovereignty over 2,000 years ago with the Roman conquest of what they termed the province of Judea, maintained their distinctive identity. Yet maintaining your distinctive identity came at a cost. Their security depended on the ruler's indulgence, and they lived in a constant state of anxiety that Christian and later Islamic rulers would turn against them. The precarious nature of their existence is nowhere better illustrated than in 1306, where to pay off his own debt and address his fiscal crisis, Philip IV of France suddenly ordered over 100,000 Jews to leave and confiscated their possessions and property, perhaps an early expropriation without compensation, and a shattering event for these relatively settled communities. In less than 10 years, in 1315, Louis X, needing money that some Jewish communities retained, passed a legal charter which allowed some Jews to come back for a temporary period of 12 years under strict financial and difficult conditions, and required them to wear a humiliating armband. Just 6 years later, a serious persecution of the Jews began under Philip V, and his successor, Charles IV, eventually expelled them once again. Several hundred years later, with the Reformation and the rise of Protestantism, internal divisions within Christianity placed the question of the treatment of religious minorities at the center of political philosophy. The 17th century philosopher John Locke famously wrote a letter concerning toleration, in which he argues that governments should tolerate diverse religious beliefs and practices, including those of the Jews. Such ideas had huge influence and eventually reached their legal instantiation in the French and American revolutions. The First Amendment of the American Constitution famously rejects any establishment of an official state religion and protects religious liberty against government coercion. Article 10 of the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen protects religious belief. And in the aftermath of the French Revolution, Napoleon, most importantly, embeds in the Napoleonic Code the civic equality of the Jews, which meant equality before the law and access to professions, education, and property ownership. With Napoleon's conquests across Europe, many of these ideas were spread further afield, leading to the improvements in the prospects of Jews across Europe that Professor Mendelsohn mentioned. Now, as Professor Mendelsohn explained, apart from a small community that arrived earlier, most Jews moved to South Africa from the Pale of Settlement between the 1880s to 1930. They came from a context in which many experienced squalor, prejudice, discrimination, and at times violence. The precarious nature of their lives was famously captured in the name of the stage musical Fiddler on the Roof, where the fiddler could fall off the roof any time. Indeed, I recall vividly how my own grandmother told me of grievous anti-Semitic insults that were thrown at her in Lithuania. In contrast, the Jews arriving in what is now South Africa in the 19th century, or the later part of the 19th century, found that the Enlightenment ethos I had mentioned had strongly influenced the British-ruled Cape, which respected religious freedom, allowed Jews to own property, to run businesses, and even be elected to parliament. Even though the Jews had been subject to formally enshrined discrimination in the Afrikaner republics, with the victory of the British in the South African War in 1902, this ethos which removed a naked discrimination within the law was removed in relation to Jews. No sooner were Jews establishing themselves in South Africa than there was once again an explosion of anti-Semitism in the 1930s, mirrored by events occurring again across the world, that was to remind them of the previous nature of their situation. Senior Afrikaner political leaders such as Malan and Verwoerd, who were to become the architects of apartheid, spoke in blatantly discriminatory ways about Jews, arguing that they were unassimilable and that they threatened the national aspirations of Afrikanerdom. The pressure from the sector led to severe legal restrictions of the immigration of Jews, and in their time of greatest need, with the rise of Hitler in Germany, the doors of South Africa were effectively slammed shut by the Alien Act of 1937. Groups such as the Ossewa Brandwacht openly supported the Nazi Party during the Second World War. And following the destruction of 6 million Jews in Europe, the rise to power of that very same D.F. Malan and his National Party in 1948 was terrifying to the Jewish community. These events once again enshrined a sense of insecurity, and as Malan himself had said earlier, that Jews were simply guests in South Africa. Indeed, in response, many brave Jews joined the liberation movements in South Africa, recognizing that the struggle for equality must be a general one, including all South Africa's people. Most Jews voted for relatively liberal parties that were opposed to the National Party. Nevertheless, most also accommodated themselves to the apartheid reality and benefited from it. The formal institutions of the Jewish community sought out cordial relations with the government. And as is well known, the Jewish Board of Deputies only formally condemned apartheid in 1985 and most of the rabbinate failed to take strong positions against it. The chief Orthodox Rabbi Cyril Harris, during the tenure of the Truth Commission, famously made an apology for this weak response of the formal organized community, which he said went against the entire thrust of Jewish moral teaching. In trying to explain but not justify this weak response, Franz Auerbach, a principled and firm opponent of apartheid, recognized that the formal community responded more strongly. Had the formal community responded more strongly, a powerful anti-Semitic agitation would have been unleashed, which would have endangered the security of the Jewish community. The apartheid state's repressive authoritarianism played into and exacerbated the sense of insecurity. The advent of constitutional democracy from 1994 onwards has the potential symbolically and legally to provide Jews with a sense of secure belonging and to transform their connection to the state from being mere guests or simply being tolerated to being fully respective citizens. The Constitution, in its preamble, recognizes that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity, and it expressly protects rights ranging from equality and non-discrimination, freedom of conscience and religious belief, to the right to enjoy one's culture, religion, or use one's language. These rights are shored up through Chapter 9 institutions, with judges being granted strong powers to ensure they are fulfilled. That civic equality has not only enhanced the dignity of the community, but also enabled it to have a degree of confidence in challenging the government of the day. In 2004, Tony Leon, who I see is here, gave eloquent expression to the shift in an address to the Cape Council of the Jewish Board of Deputies. He stated that it is unclear why the leaders of the Jewish community should feel that they have to ask favors from anyone at all. The security of the Jewish community and its members is not a privilege granted by the government, the ruling party, or the police services. It is a constitutional right. That shift is evident in the contrast between the cautious equivocations of the Board of Deputies in condemning apartheid in the 1960s and 70s, with its current position where it has often been openly and stridently critical of the South African government, in particular on its stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The strength of the current opposition is only possible, I would suggest, against a backdrop of self-confidence brought about by the entrenchment of constitutional rights in South Africa. It has also led the organized community to utilize the Chapter 9 institutions as well as the courts to fight instances of anti-Semitism with a large degree of success. Moreover, the sense of belonging and connection to the broader South African community has also led since 1994 to an extraordinary number of significant contributions by Jews and Jewish organizations in a range of fields, including law, medicine, politics, academia, art, and much else. Jewish organizations have also sought to play an active role in addressing the problems faced by the country, such as poverty alleviation. For instance, in my student days, I sat on the inaugural board of Africa Tikkun, which has become a large organization helping to ensure education and careers for children from previously disadvantaged backgrounds. The constitutional shift in South Africa also created a change in the internal dynamics of the community, with constitutional rights enabling the creation of new organizations and placing constraints on existing organizations. I was involved in the founding of an organization for LGBTQ Jews called Jewish Outlook, which would have been unimaginable in apartheid South Africa. Another organization, Limud South Africa, which I also helped co-found, in many ways gave expression to the new constitutional ethos in the Jewish community. It sought to bring together people across the wide-ranging diversity in the community to learn together in an atmosphere of openness and respect. And the commitment in our constitution to gender equality enabled a challenge to the Jewish Board of Deputies policy only to allow men to sing at the annual Holocaust Memorial Ceremony. An imperfect settlement was reached, but demonstrated how the constitutional era had shifted the internal dynamics of the community itself and placed constitutional constraints on communal institutions. So if the constitutional era has opened up such exciting possibilities for Jews both internally and as respected citizens, why have so many Jews immigrated, as is demonstrated by the demographics Professor Mendelsohn presented? I would suggest that the reason ultimately relates to the lack of realization of the promises of the new constitutional order itself, and more recently, how that particularly plays out in relation to Jews themselves. For a community with the history of insecurity, dispossession, and oppression that Professor Mendelsohn raised, and I briefly discussed, the late 1990s brought daily traumas of people being hijacked and murdered, and these crimes affected all South Africans, but led many people to conclude that they could not be safe anymore in South Africa. Sadly, the inability to tackle violent crime continues, and just last month, another high-profile murder took place of Stephen Grusd, a respected academic who was prominent in the Jewish community and once again entrenched the sense of insecurity. Moreover, the state capture era involving serious violations of the Constitution further undermined the economy as well as confidence in the government. The era of load shedding and now water shedding represented in many ways the malaise that had beset governing structures and meant that many felt that the basic features of good governance were deteriorating. The riots of July 2021 and the ensuing wave of civil unrest left many feeling as if the government were unable properly to guard against an insurrection against the constitutional order. All of these issues affect all South Africans, and the fate of Jewish South Africans is deeply intertwined with that of other South Africans. At the same time, Jews have particular identities and histories, and on the whole, these have been respected in South Africa, but the strong connection of most South African Jews to Israel has become particularly fraught. The overall environment that has been created in the media and within many institutions and organizations in the past 2.5 years has left many Jews feeling increasingly alienated from many facets of the South African polity. That alienation, I should stress, does not come from criticism of Israel or some of its behavior alone, which many Jews in South Africa, including myself, believe in many cases to be warranted. It is the crossover Professor Mendelsohn details from criticism to incitement, ostracizing, and the stoking of hatred against South African Jews that is leading many to feel that they are uncertain about their future in South Africa. Such speech is a violation of the Constitution and its ethos, which explicitly bans advocacy of hatred and incitement to cause harm. In a finding in 2022 that hate speech has taken place through the invocation of Hitler in a pro-Palestine social media post, the Constitutional Court distinguished between protected speech and hate speech, which it said causes physical harm or emotional and psychological harm that severely undermines the dignity of the targeted group. Sadly, that line is often being crossed in South Africa today, and in other parts of the world, hate speech has sadly translated into an actual wave of violent attacks against Jews and Jewish institutions. And I live part of the year in the UK, and I can attest to the great sense of nervousness about the simple act of going to synagogue. This point should not be overstated, with Jews on the whole in South Africa remaining free to express their religious identity, as well as their connection to Israel and diverse perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Jews also are not alone as a group against which hate speech has increased. The considerable incitement against black people who are not South African nationals is lamentable. And it is extremely distressing that instead of countering it, many politicians in fact stoke such naked xenophobia. Verbal ostracization has often spilled over into violence, leading to foreign nationals being denied life-saving healthcare and education. Legal protections and constitutional advances have been insufficient to protect their rights. Ultimately, these examples demonstrate that the realization of the promise of the Constitution is dependent not only upon state action, but also upon ensuring individuals in wider society more generally respect constitutional rights in their daily lives. In conclusion, I would hazard to say that the future flourishing of the Jews in South Africa is very much tied to the fate of the constitutional promise that was made in 1996. Should the Constitution itself be gutted, either de jure or de facto, many more Jews will leave, and those that remain will do so with a sense reminiscent of past Jewish history, of insecurity, uncertainty, and being a fiddler on the roof. Should South Africa become a country where constitutional commitments are honored, such that governance improves, crime reduces, diversity of opinions and identities are respected, incitement to hatred challenged, and poverty addressed, Jews will not only remain here, but flourish. There is no crystal ball which will tell us which way South Africa will evolve. But I hope that the latter course is actively pursued, as it will result not only in the betterment of the lives of Jews, but all of those who live in South Africa. And with that, I would like to once again congratulate Professor Mendelsohn on his elevation to a full professorship, and really hope that his lecture will catalyze more discussion on these important topics.
I'd like to also echo those words, Professor Mendelsohn. Thank you for your thoughtful and engaging and provocative lecture. Your reflections that are temporal in analysis, historical, but also your courage in attempting to predict what might happen going forward. I want to thank the family. For someone to get to a professor level, it takes a long time. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of support coming from the family, and probably tolerance as well. And Emma and Sam finally got to see what their father does when he says he goes to work. And I want to thank you for the support that you have given to Professor Mendelsohn all these years in supporting him to get to this stage. Congratulations to you as well. Let me also thank all of you for managing to survive until this point in the evening. I have to say that it's nearly 2 years since I've been Vice Chancellor here, and we have tonight, in my experience, a record attendance of an inaugural lecture. I want to sincerely apologize to those who wanted to be in the lecture but could not get into the room and had to go to the spillover room for the fact that we could not host them in the room, but also thank them for being here and for attending and for watching and for providing support. I want to also just make a quick comment. I was going to comment about Stellenbosch, but let me not do that. They are friends. What I will say though is that we beat them at the final of the Varsity Cup last year, and even though we did not, the senior team did not win Varsity Cup this year, the Ike Tigers Young Gunners won the Varsity Cup competition. The under-20 won the Varsity Cup competition for the first time since they joined in 2012. So when it comes to rugby, we are now finding a situation where we are beating Stellenbosch and others, unlike in the past. And hopefully it will continue to be. I was talking to the school principal of SAST yesterday. We had a meeting. Because I don't know if you all know that SAST was founded as one institution with the South African College until about the 1870s. So we're both planning the celebration of 200 years of the South African College in 2029. And so we were planning on how we're going to do this. And one of the things that he said was, hey, so now these young ones have to consider coming to UCT for rugby. Who would have thought? They used to go to Stellenbosch for that. So let me thank you all again for coming tonight. And please let me invite you to enjoy the rest of the evening. Let's give Professor Mendelsohn a round of applause. Please enjoy it. Let's allow the platform party to go out. Thank you very much.